the federal government bails out 100% all the states. So it's a grand bargain. The central government, it's a grand bargain and a grand quid pro quo, this for that. The central government gets the ability to tax, and as part of the deal, they assume, this is called the assumption, of all the debts of the individual states. You could ask, why did they do this? Okay, so you can find out why, because there's a report written by our first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He's not, if you're a student, he's not much older than you. He's 33 years old. He learned his economics while fighting a war. He read a couple economics books and thought hard about them. And he had theories of economics and politics. And so he writes in this report on public credit, it's about 12 pages long. It's very closely reasoned. He said, here's the reason the federal government is going to bail out the states. Because this is a democracy. We've rewritten the Constitution, and I want to arrange political interests so that I get outcomes that I want. And what I want to happen is very open about it. What I want to happen is I want the new Congress to levy the tariff to raise the revenues that's going to service the government debt. And I want a political majority to be in favor of raising the taxes so you can service the government debt. And who do I want to be attached to the central government and to vote in favor of, have their legislators vote in favor of raising taxes to central government? I want the bondholders of the states to become advocates of a strong central government that's going to tax enough to service their debt. That's what he said. So this was controversial, but they did it. The first Congress does this, and guess what happens? I mentioned this hedge fund opportunity, 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. Those bonds went from 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, not quite to par, but they went way up. Huge capital gains after the Constitution and the first Congress. They went from 10 or 20 cents on the dollar to 80 cents on the dollar. And Alexander Hamilton asks, why do we want to pay this debt? And he says, it's not because I like the old bondholders. It's because we might have to borrow in the future. And he gives reasons why. He says, this is an uncertain world. He says, by the way, Britain, the last century, he's writing this in 1790, the last century, the reason Britain is a very powerful country is that it has the ability to borrow. And it borrowed to finance itself during wars. And he said, God forbid, we may actually have wars in the future. And we want a reputation for having national credit. And in addition, he said, who knows? It might not just be wars. It might be, there could be future opportunities that we can't possibly foresee that we're going to have to borrow for. So I want good credit. And the Founding Fathers wanted it. And they wanted it to the extent that they pulled off this political revolution and rewrote the Constitution to rearrange interests so that the democracy would levy the taxes needed to service the government debt, even though it was costly. All of our principles are in play. And Hamilton and Washington are answering our questions in a certain way. So they killed Ronald Reagan's government that couldn't tax, spend, and borrow, and they created one that could. And okay, so guess what? So fast forward about 12 years, and an opportunity came into the United States government's horizon. And do you know what it is? Napoleon Bonaparte. So here's the deal. The United States wanted to buy New Orleans, which was in French hands. Napoleon Bonaparte owned it. So U.S. offered him $10 million for it's a lot of money for New Orleans. And Napoleon came back. Napoleon was strapped for money, and he was distracted with other things. He said, how about this? You give me $15 million, and I'll give you all of Louisiana. You can more than double the size of the United States. And so the United States government did not have $15 million, but it had credit, and it borrowed it in England, by the way. So Hamilton was right. That's what we did. Okay. So, so that's how we created a fiscal union. Now, notice the following thing. I want to give you like a little lesson. There's going to be a lesson here. So the story doesn't end. A beautiful thing about history is things never end, and there are unanticipated and unplanned consequences, and there are reputations. Reputations are multifaceted things. You know that if you live. You live with your reputation. And you are not in control of your reputation because, you understand that? Because so think hard about the word reputation. That's why economics is beautiful. Okay. So, I'll just give you a little example. I'll just make this personal. My wife and me. I have a reputation with my wife. Well, who owns that reputation? It's in her head, not me. It's her expectations of things I do in the future. That's called my reputation. But it's in her head. So Alexander Hamilton and George Washington created a reputation of the United States vis-a-vis its creditors. Okay? But notice how they did it. To do it, they also created a reputation, or maybe they did. Remember, a reputation is about what other people expect you're going to do in the future. They created a reputation vis-a-vis the states who they bailed out. So talk about bailouts. My government, you know, Pledge of Allegiance and all that stuff, was born in a massive bailout of all the states. That's what we were born. And so people noticed that. The federal government backstopped the states. Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward and tell you like a consequence of, and there's going to be another little lesson here of the this discussion I had with Milton Friedman about fiscal crises often producing political revolutions, where by a political revolution I mean rewriting the Constitution. Not guns in the streets, necessarily, but ripping up the Constitution, writing a new one, who decides what, where, when. So I'll give you one piece of information. The United States, our individual states all have constitutions. There's 50 state constitutions. Most of those constitutions have clauses, almost all of them, that require the governments of those states to balance the budget year in and year out. They can't run deficits. Milton Friedman actually wanted the federal government to have a balanced budget amendment, but we don't have one. Federal government can run deficits, but the state governments can't. Now, in the original, in the beginning of our republic, the state governments could run deficits. Their constitutions let them run deficits. Why not? The federal government could. But that changed because of a story I'm going to tell you. That changed. So why did that change? And this is going to be a lesson of fiscal crises often produce political revolutions, one way or another. So here's what happened. Okay, so go to 1795, U.S. government gains credit. And the states have been completely bailed out. And in the 1820s and 1830s, new technologies came online, kind of like now. And the new technologies were for roads, railroads, and canals, infrastructure projects. And so these are big projects, and private enterprise either wouldn't do them or couldn't do them because of capital limitations. And a lot of people said the state should do it. The federal government wouldn't do it for various reasons that I won't get into. So the state governments had to do it. So the state government said, okay, you've heard of the Erie Canal? That's financed by New York. So many states started getting in the business of either building or subsidizing firms, private firms, to build railroads. And they did this, so see if this sounds familiar. They did this, these are infrastructure projects, and they were going to pay for themselves. The idea is we're going to build a railroad, property values are going to go up, state revenues are going to go up, and those increased taxes will be used to service the bonds, no problem. These are going to be self-financing. Okay, so in the late 1820s and 1830s, state governments issued huge amounts of debt. Really big debt. I could tell you the numbers. And then what happened is there's a financial crisis in 1837. And many of these states, between 1837 and 1840, many of these state bonds go belly up. They go, they're technically defaulted on. They're not paying interest, and some are outright repudiated. Okay, so now who bought these bonds? Well, most of them were bought in Britain, Great Britain. And why not? The United States had good credit. So what happened was the creditors of the United States, of these states and various state governments went to the Congress and they said the following: in the spirit of Alexander Hamilton, remember that this country was born in a massive bailout. Do it again. And there's a big debate in Congress. And this time Congress says no. It's actually a close vote. There are multiple votes. Congress says no, won't bail you out. And so these bonds go belly up. Actually, the British creditors, they kind of get upset. And actually, there's a curious thing about this. They didn't do their reading. I don't know if you're a hedge fund person or so. I don't mean to be critical or give you any advice, but read carefully. Okay, so these guys had read carefully. They had read the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution says state governments must pay their debts. Right there. It's required. Fine. They did not read the 11th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. So the first 10 amendments are our Bill of Rights, very spectacular, dramatic, freedom of speech and assembly. The 11th Amendment is really boring, but go read it. But what it says, it was passed very early. What it says is if you are a creditor of a state government and you don't live in that state, you live abroad, you cannot enforce a debt against a state in a federal court. You have to go to the state court. And guess what? The state court of Alabama is not going to give a British person anything. That's in the Constitution. Anyway, that was in there. So guess what happened was the United States, all these states defaulted. And British creditors punished not only the states, but the United States government for a generation. And the United States really didn't care because we weren't borrowing much until the Civil War. Okay, so the end of the story is, what were the consequences? After that, the federal government just didn't bail them out. After that, basically said, we couldn't care less. Moral hazard. After that, the state governments, one by one, massively in the early 1840s, they rewrote their constitutions by themselves. Not because the federal government told them. They rewrote their constitutions to prohibit themselves from ever running deficits. And that's why state governments in the United States, to this day, can't run deficits, and it's a bad rule. And it's a rule because they didn't trust themselves. So now you kind of ask yourself, stand back and say, and you'll see it's our theme. And it's about G1 and G2 and all that stuff. So, did the Congress do the right thing in 1840? And what difference would it have made? And then you start thinking, just like bailing out your brother or your sister, or maybe they bail you out. If the Congress had bailed out the states at that time, do you think they would have the Congress would have said, oh, sure, and just do what you want? What probably would have happened is the federal government would have said, we'll bail you out, but there's going to be a deal. We're going to regulate you. We're going to start taking over your sovereignty. You can't decide what to spend or borrow. The federal government's going to do it for you. Congress decided it wasn't going to get in that business, and it changed the whole federal structure of the United States, partly reflected in the rewriting of these constitutions. So fiscal crises often produce political revolutions. That's kind of a fact. Hope it's... Don't mean to depress you. But I guess that's enough. Economics is great fun. And as you see, this is just common sense. And a little bit of sense. It's a common sense and a little bit of people kind of operate in their own in their own best interests. You ask, what is the relevance of this to Europe? Well, actually, my friend George Stigler said, there's nothing new in economic theory. He said a revolution. He said a war can ravage half a continent and raise no new issues in economic theory. Great statement. And the kind of principle here is fast forward to Europe today and ask what it looks like. Europe has a central government now that's very weak. It really can't tax. It can't regulate. That's what Brussels is. And now there are people like Gerhard Schroeder. So he has spoken openly and called for a United States of Europe. And it's a massive quid pro quo. It's a product. It's a project. It is a project to create a revolution. I mean, he doesn't say it that way, but it amounts that way. He wants to rewrite the Constitution of Europe to make someone of Germany, if he lives in Germany or Italy, not be a citizen of Germany or Italy, or think of them, but to be a citizen of Europe. So he wants to transfer fiscal sovereignty to a central government that unifies things. And you could ask, why does he want to do that? And actually, if you're an Italian, so I'm kind of speaking off the record, if you're Italian, you could scratch your head and say, wait a minute, this rings a bell. This isn't the first German to want a United States of Europe. And the previous, maybe it's the second, and maybe it's the third in the last 100 years. And the first two were doing it by force of arms. And they were warlike. And that's similar, but there's a huge difference. The people in Germany that want to do it now are just the opposite. It's a project of peace. They want to bind Germans to Europe. And if you hear Schroeder talk, he talks about the legacy of World War II, and it's kind of not trusting the nationality. It's against nationalism, and trying to make change loyalties. And I view that as a noble effort. And it's like, I think it's among the fundamental, it's kind of among the fundamental things of both of social science, but as citizens, about how we think about putting constitutions together and what we want to achieve in the ways we live together. And that's all I have to say.